Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going somewhere really unique.
Yeah.
We're diving into the lost fighting arts of Vietnam,
Oh,
as explored by Dr. Ha Ha Lung.
very cool.
This was actually suggested to us by you, the learner.
Oh, excellent choice.
And we thought, wow, this is perfect
Yeah.
because you're all about, getting knowledge quickly and thoroughly,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to kind of these unique, maybe even overlooked areas of study.
Right.
So our mission here is to really extract those core insights
Yeah.
from this book for you and really focus on what makes Vietnamese martial traditions so surprising,
Yeah.
particularly within, the context of the Cao Dai religion.
Absolutely. This is not just some kind of manual of moves, is it?
No.
It's really compelling how Dr. Lung kind of weaves in the history, the culture,
Right.
even the spiritual underpinnings of these fighting arts. I think we're going to find some real aha moments here
Oh, yeah.
as we explore, Vietnam's long history of conflict, the specifics of, how they developed their combat methods, and even the philosophy behind things like, stealth and
Right.
espionage.
So the first section we jump into is Chung Gai, Spikes and Thorns. Even the title itself.
Evocative.
Yeah, very evocative. It kind of sets the stage, doesn't it?
Totally.
For this idea that Vietnam's history, it's been defined by these spikes and thorns, this, relentless cycle of invasion and warfare.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because the book frames their fighting arts not just as like a pastime or something, but as like a fundamental, science of survival.
Yeah. This is crucial, isn't it? When we think about it, it's almost like this constant external pressure almost like forges a unique identity.
Right.
Right? And so you see how this kind of enduring threat shaped their society, at a very deep level.
Of course.
And the martial arts came directly out of that necessity. Yep. It's interesting, too. The book gives us a little bit of a geographical overview, highlighting those three key regions.
Oh, yeah.
You've got the Mekong Delta, you've got the Central Highlands, and then that coastal strip. And each one has its own, its own historical significance.
It wasn't just about fending off, external forces, though.
No.
Right? It was also about these really interesting early cultural currents.
Yeah.
That kind of layered on top of, the existing indigenous traditions. We're talking about Indian traders bringing in Hinduism and Buddhism. Mm-hmm. You've got that profound influence of Chinese culture.
Especially in the north.
Especially in the north, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, you've got the Kingdom of Champa in the south. And all of these interacting with, the existing animistic beliefs.
Yeah.
So it's like from the get-go, you've got this really dynamic cultural landscape.
It's this layering, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's key to understanding richness of their traditions. And it makes you think, right? It raises a fascinating question for you, the learner, which is, how does a culture maintain its own distinctiveness when it's constantly absorbing all these influences from outside?
Yeah.
Right. And it seems like the answer might lie in that continuous struggle for independence.
Right.
The book emphasizes this idea of to strive and to struggle, or, in Vietnamese, it's Phan Dao. And you see this play out in the face of the Chinese, the French, the Japanese, the Americans.
Right.
So this persistent pursuit of self-determination, it really left its mark on their martial arts. And a key insight here is it wasn't just physical resistance,
Right.
It was a cultural imperative, like deep down in their soul.
So we've got this land shaped by conflict.
Yeah.
A fascinating blend of cultural influences.
Right.
And now we turn to Cao Dai, the high tower.
Okay.
Which introduces us to kind of the religious and philosophical context. Yeah. Now, for those who maybe aren't familiar, Cao Dai is described as this really extraordinary 20th century Vietnamese religion.
Yeah.
And it synthesizes, it's almost mind-boggling, elements of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, all kind of interwoven
together
with spiritism and ancestor worship.
And what's so fascinating is that this didn't just emerge in a vacuum, right?
Right.
If we connect it back to all those historical currents, those foreign influences that we've been talking about, it starts to seem like a very uniquely Vietnamese response to a complex world, The book dives into Yuma, which is, the spirits and the saints, reminding us that animism, this was like the original spiritual bedrock of Vietnam. The importance of spirits, via and vigor, and the deep tradition of ancestor worship. These are fundamental, right? And even, shamanistic practices and seances played a role in Cao Dai's founding. So they had that direct connection with the spirit world.
That's a surprising element, the seances.
Yeah.
And it actually connects to the next point here, which is Tam Jiao, or the three ways.
Right.
Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and how they each kind of individually shaped and then merged within Vietnamese culture.
Yeah.
Can you give us a sense of how those each contributed to the thought that ultimately informed Cao Dai?
Sure. So Confucianism, right, with its emphasis on social harmony through respect for hierarchy and order, probably influenced, Cao Dai's own structure, right, the organization. And then you've got Taoism, which focuses on living in harmony with the natural flow of the universe, the balance of opposing forces. So maybe that contributed to Cao Dai's syncretic nature, seeking that harmony amongst different faiths.
Right.
And then Buddhism, centered on compassion, the cycle of suffering and liberation. Perhaps that provided a kind of moral and ethical framework. And what's crucial is that these weren't just separate systems, right? They were interwoven deeply within the culture over centuries, creating this really rich tapestry of beliefs.
The book also touches on the cross and double cross.
Oh, yeah.
Which is the influence of Christianity and Western esotericism, like the Jesuits and the Freemasons.
Oh.
And it sounds like their interactions with Vietnamese society and these emerging religious movements were...
I think complex is the key word.
Yeah.
What's really insightful here for you, the learner, is that while Christianity introduced new theological concepts, right?
Yeah.
You've already got this existing spiritual landscape and a strong desire for a unified Vietnamese identity. So that shaped how these Western ideas were received and integrated, or in some cases, actively resisted.
Right.
And then the Jesuits and the Freemasons, that just adds a whole other layer of intrigue, doesn't it? Because it suggests a cross-pollination, not just of spiritual ideas, but organizational and philosophical ones.
It wasn't just a one-way street.
Not at all.
Yeah. And from this kind of, cultural and religious, ferment.
Yeah.
We get the call to the high tower, the founding of Cao Dai by Nguyen Ngo Van Chieu, and its remarkably rapid growth.
Yeah.
And the central tenets, this unification of religions, a strong emphasis on morality, vegetarianism, the veneration of ancestors and spirits.
Yeah.
It seems to clearly reflect this desire for synthesis that we've been talking about.
It does.
It developed a really distinctive organizational structure, didn't it?
Yes.
With popes and cardinals and saints.
Yeah, almost like fusion of Eastern and Western hierarchies.
Okay.
Yeah. And, if we connect this back to Vietnam's history of kind of adapting and reshaping foreign influences, this is another great example of that.
Right.
It's really important to understand that this wasn't just a spiritual movement.
Right.
This was also entangled in, Vietnamese politics.
Yeah.
The book talks about its initial support and then later conflict with the Diem regime.
Right.
And its eventual suppression by the communists.
Right.
But despite all that, this tumultuous history, it remains a significant force in Vietnam today.
Yeah.
Which I think speaks to how deeply rooted it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us to the third section, Can Qua, Shield and Spear.
Okay.
The martial arts of Cao Dai.
Cool.
And the book tells us that these techniques, half learned, are merely tricks.
Right.
They're rooted in that necessity for self-defense within this context of political and religious struggles. So it's not just about physical skill. It's really intrinsically linked.
Yeah, to survive.
To survival,
Yeah.
In a really challenging environment.
Absolutely. The book introduces us to Kong Kem, the two-pronged attack. Which really kind of drives home that dual emphasis, right? It's not just about the physical techniques. It's about mental preparedness. Know yourself, know your enemy, know your environment. What I find really interesting is this explicit integration of Sun Tzu's principles from Ping Fa, the art of war. So it highlights that strategic and intellectual dimension that underpins the martial arts.
Absolutely.
And then within Cao Dai, you've got this concept of both hard and soft styles.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So hard styles emphasize, direct force.
Yeah.
Soft styles focus on yielding and redirection.
But much more sense and nuanced approach.
Nuanced, yeah.
Yeah.
To combat. Now, getting into, the specifics of Fado unarmed combat.
Right.
The book outlines a range of, principles. Movement, Kuyen, striking, Shichthu, blocking, Shoang, grappling.
Trithu, Chohung, Ba, and takedowns. And it even describes specific techniques. It uses these vivid names like the turtle's head strike, the monkey's paw, and there's various kicks and strangulation holds. It sounds like
sounds very comprehensive.
Very comprehensive and practical system.
Sure. It is. I mean, what's so fascinating is the level of detail, right? Even with those evocative names, right? Which I'm sure, kind of hint at the movements involved.
Right.
It gives you a glimpse into the practical application. The book also talks about this collapsing principle for maximizing force. Which is, you see that in a lot of different martial arts traditions where the idea is to generate, huge power through efficient body mechanics.
Right.
And it stresses the importance of developing form, which is the correct execution of the techniques.
Right.
But also flow. Right. So being able to seamlessly transition between those.
Right.
In response to an opponent.
And we get to Badam combat with weapons. And the book categorizes weapons into these 5 kinds. You've got bludgeons, bladed weapons, flexible weapons, hurling weapons, and even psychological weapons, referred to as amheim.
Okay.
And it gives examples like the Vietnamese stick, the doi, bamboo, the letter whip, the voot. But then there's also this really interesting idea that surprise and fear themselves can be these potent weapons.
Right. So that's a really insightful categorization. I think what stands out for you, the learner, is that inclusion of psychological weapons. It really underscores a sophisticated understanding that combat isn't just this purely physical exchange. It's mental and emotional.
Totally.
Right. So that broad classification, it reflects a very practical, holistic approach to self-defense.
In a dangerous world.
Yeah.
And then that leads us to amheim, subterfuge and stealth.
Okay.
This section really emphasizes that need for survival in conflict.
Right.
That extends beyond, direct...
just the fighting.
The fighting, the physical engagement. It discusses principles of espionage, Aokan, special skills, and this really compelling concept of the black science of psychological warfare.
Oh, wow.
Amvan. The book even says, covert operations are vital to your war effort.
Right.
It's almost like a martial art of...
intelligence.
Intelligence gathering and manipulation.
It really highlights how intensely pragmatic this is. If you're in a situation of constant conflict, simply being a skilled fighter isn't enough.
Right.
You need to be able to gather information, move undetected, influence your opponent's mind. So this section really underscores that these traditions weren't just about combat techniques. It was a comprehensive strategy for navigating a hostile world.
So as we bring this deep dive into the lost fighting arts of Vietnam to a close, what are the key takeaways for you, the learner?
It's clear that Vietnamese fighting arts, particularly within that Cao Dai tradition, there's so much more than just physical techniques. What I find fascinating is how deeply they're interwoven with Vietnam's long and, often turbulent history. They embody this really unique fusion of, religious and philosophical influences, blending those indigenous beliefs with those from India, China, even the West. And at their core, they represent this very practical and comprehensive approach to survival, emphasizing not only, physical prowess, but also mental acuity, strategic thinking, even the art of deception and intelligence gathering.
It really makes you consider, given this history and this incredible synthesis of so many influences, how might these principles still be manifesting in Vietnamese culture today? Maybe even in unexpected areas.
Right, exactly. Well, maybe we see echoes of this resilience, this adaptability, this strategic thinking in, various facets of their society, from their, entrepreneurial spirit to their, approaches on the global stage. Hopefully this has provided you with some really fascinating insights.
Oh, yeah.
And sparked your curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely.
To, keep exploring this really rich and surprising subject.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope you found it enlightening. This is The Deep Dive, signing off.